for 25 plus years. He's done a ton of research on this. It's well over 100 hours, what we've estimated for him to come up with this. It started as a curiosity. Hey, how did New Hartford start? Where'd it come from? So David just started to do some research, came up with this. I gotta say, we are super lucky to have someone like David to work for us. He's greatly appreciated all his work he's done over the years. So can I get another round of applause for David? All right, so I'd like to call David our historical detective, because the work that he did to get to this, to the point that we are now, is just amazing. The resources, he'll go through all that stuff as we go. So with that, let's just get started. What do you think, David?
Give me the next slide.
Okay. I'll let you have that.
This is my first presentation of this format, so I may stumble here and there, but I think you'll get the message.
Just sound check. Everyone good? Everyone hear David in the back?
David, do use the microphone.
Hold the mic to your mouth. Hold it closer.
Yeah,
Okay,
there you go.
perfect. I can do that. All right. What I'd like people to understand is that I didn't have to go anyplace other than the town clerk's office to get the information that I'm going to communicate tonight. I didn't have to go to Hartford. I didn't have to go to the Connecticut Historical Society. So when you see what I've done, if your curiosity is piqued about the history of the property from which your house exists, you can do the same thing. With the maps that I've created, you can do the same thing. So the beauty of this and the town of New Hartford is that it's really a microcosm of the whole development of the country. When you realize that people came across the ocean, they didn't know what the heck they were going to find here, but they came on the chance that things were going to be better. And then once they got here, they developed rules and regulations, and they divided up the property. Same thing happened in New Hartford. But let's reflect just a little bit before there was even the Pilgrims coming to Plymouth Rock. Does anybody here have any idea what the first English settlers that established a community on this continent, approximate date, the country that did it? Supposedly the oldest house in the country, which we now know as the United States, was St. Augustine, Florida. And it was established in 1885.
50.
Pilgrims, as we all know from our education, word on education, I'm not sure our kids know when the Pilgrims came anymore, but 1620. Before 1620, there was Jamestown, so the English came. So there was a long period of time, but very quickly, 1620. In 1636, there were a group of people that came from Great Britain, led by Reverend Thomas Hooker. And Thomas Hooker brought his clan and said, gee, I don't know how many people there were. This part is not in the town records, but this is before I get to the town records. He said, it doesn't look like there's enough land here for me to establish a church and a community, but I hear there's land west of here, near this river. So he went to the colonial governor in Massachusetts and said, well, if you want to follow our rules, just follow our rules, go down there and set up some towns. So what it ended up is by 1636, that's 16 years after 1620, these people, 100 plus people, women, children, livestock, whatever, tracked about 100 miles overland. I don't believe there was a road, you know, so they're wandering through the forest, going through Indian paths or whatever. But when he got here, he discovered that there was already a group of people settled to the north of that in a place that was called Windsor. He established Hartford, and also at that same time were a group of people that all settled in what is now Wethersfield. And that was the beginning of the English here in Connecticut. This was in the 1600s. What happened after that is more and more people came because Connecticut, because of the river valley, was fertile. We had a long coastline. And so the development of people then was by ship along the coastline. So that continued for a while, but by the mid-1600s, we had New York, Governor Andros, trying to invade into Connecticut. And so the Connecticut legislature at that time said, we don't have anybody living out there. We got to do something to encourage people to live out there. You have to understand that at this point in time, all the development occurred because citizens discovered land that was valuable. And they would get a bunch of citizens together and they would go to the colonial government and say, we'd like to buy some land to establish a town. So the land was put up for auction and those people who bid on it achieved it. So that's the way the towns developed. But when this controversy arrived between Connecticut and New York about where is the boundary, the legislature said, we better get some people out there to settle. So they gave the land to the taxpayers of Hartford and Windsor. So this was a land grant. So this story is about what happens when the people who were entitled to this big property, how did they divide it up? Finally coming up with a parcel that ends up being New Hartford. So let me reflect on a minute where I am. So what I wanted to do was to give you that brief story. And after that brief story, show you some maps with some information on it that will reinforce what I just told you. It's the old presentation technique. Tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So at any rate, finally, this big parcel of land, the Connecticut legislature, when the border between Connecticut and New York was settled, the Connecticut legislature smacked themselves on the head and said, what did you do here? We drove these thousands of acres. And I estimate it's probably 300,000 acres in the western part, all the way up to the corner, which now would include Canaan and Salisbury and Kent and that whole thing. Colonial legislature. No, we made a mistake, we're not going to do that. The citizens of Hartford and Windsor said, "What, are you nuts? You're not going to get away with that, you promised us that." So it all went to court. And by 1726, you're not going to remember these dates. I want you to remember the sequence of how these things happen, because it's the sequence that happened. So by 1726, the court had decided we're going to divide it in half. And these parcels over here, Hartford and Windsor, will have the rights to that land. But the western part, which is now, as I said, Salisbury, Kent, and Canaan, North Canaan, rather, the colonial government's going to keep that. And if people want to settle there, we'll put it up for auction. So the fascinating thing to me is that how taxpayers of Hartford and taxpayers of Windsor in the 1700s got together. I don't know how many taxpayers there were in Windsor, but there were 400 in Hartford. So 400 in Hartford, and let's say there were 400 in Windsor. Did they have 800 people to get together and decide how they're going to divide this up? Probably not. So when you think about that, you say, well, gee, this is all about communities are formed, how rules and regulations are established, how leaders are chosen. So that to me is a fascinating story in itself. But here they were, these 800 people who've never been out here because they're in Hartford, and it's 20 miles to get to New Hartford and another 10 miles to get to the next parcel. Those individuals can't possibly come out here and look at this thing. So they sent some surveyors out there, go out there, survey the property, come back and tell us what's there. A longer story short, Windsor and Hartford people got together and they divided the land into 7 parcels. All of those parcels were about 6 miles by 6 miles, 24,000 acres. Anybody have an idea why they chose 6 miles by 6 miles? Well, the reason is because, and it makes logic when you think about it, this was a congregational migration, and church was important. This was primary part of their lives, other than whatever they do to support their own family. So they said, well, 6 miles by 6 miles, anybody settling within that thing, even at the farthest corner, is going to be 3 miles away from the center. And if they're smart, they're going to put the meeting house and the church there. So that's why there were 6 miles by 6 miles. So now we have 7 parcels, bing, 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 and 1 down here. And I said, okay, Windsor, Hartford, Windsor, Hartford, whatever it was. Anyway, you'll see it on the map. So they spread them out, alternating. They said, okay, you taxpayers from Hartford, go away and decide how you are going to divide up your parcels. So what did those guys do? they had the same problem. They said, well, we gotta show people what the land is like, so for them to decide whether they wanna go there or not. But at any rate, 181 of the 400 said, I want to live in this parcel down here, and it was called the southeast parcel. So the 181 people got together. They were called proprietors because they had rights to this land. They didn't own any yet, but they had rights to it. So they sent a survey out there saying, we know what the boundaries are, but tell us what's there. Are there any streams? Are there any mountains? Are there any swamps? What's there? So you will see from the map, and here I took some latitude. The town records show the survey that establishes the boundary. It doesn't show a map, because that's the thing I was looking for, the map. So I said, well, the surveyors came back and said, well, there's a place there called Wonk-Sunk-a-Munk Pond, and there's a place there called Yellow Mountain, and there's a place there called Masked Swamp, and there's a place there called Woodruff's Bar, and there's a place there that's called Pine Meadow. So I said, well, where are those places? And I assumed that the rivers really hadn't moved much from then till today. So I took the latitude of laying the boundary out, copying the flow of the rivers there, and then putting labels on things that the surveyor said, this is the approximate area where we found Yellow Mountain. So I knew there was a mountain there, so where's the mountain? Well, I said, I know that's the mountain, so that's gotta be the mountain. There's a swampy area called the Masked Swamp, and I assumed where that was, so that went on the map. So the surveyors obviously knew this. So they came back to these 181 people and said, well, here's the layout of the land. What do you do from here? And they gave the people, I think, 6 or 8 months to decide which parcels they wanted. So by September, 181 said, I picked this parcel. And now we're talking about what happened after that. So the surveyors came back with a map. They had a meeting which was called the proprietors meeting. Now this is the beauty of the files that are downstairs. They're not printed, they're in cursive, they're written in ink. Remember, we're talking about a period here where there are no roads, there were no copiers, there were no typewriters. So these people are drawing these maps, and then they're having meetings in Hartford at the state, and the proprietors' meetings are just a beautiful thing to read. What they did at the first meeting, who was the moderator? They elected a treasurer, they elected a formal kind of governing board. And they said, well, let's just, 181 people wanted to come here. We'll throw their names in a hat. And the surveyor said, there's good land just north of Yellow Mountain and off to the west to Wonk-Sunk-a-Munk Pond. And there's enough land there that's arable, reasonable, where people can establish, if they want to come here, they can establish their home lot. So they arbitrarily laid out 181 lots. Well, they didn't lay them out there. They picked the names. And this is the interesting process. This was called the first division of the land. After the first division of land, there was still more land, so they had to decide how they're going to divide that up. But let's leave that for just a minute. So they threw the names in the hat, and they picked out the name, and they said, it looks like the tax records in Hartford indicate your estate is worth, in pounds, let's say 50 pounds. And we think this first division of land, we should give you a quarter of an acre of land for every pound of taxes, or not. They're not paying that in taxes, but that's the value on which the tax is based. So your lot is going to be 1/4 of a pound, 1/4 of an acre per pound, 100 pounds, did I say? Your lot is number 1, and it's 25 acres. Pick the next one. His estate was 40, so he gets 10 acres. The next guy, they look on the list, and they say, well, you get 6, you get 7. They did this 181 times, around there. Now, it's further interesting because many of those, or some of those 181 said, I have the rights to this land, but I have a comfortable life here in Hartford. No way. I'm going out here. And the guy next door says, will you sell me your rights? So they started selling their rights. So what happened, even in the first division of land, the first guy that they picked, and I said he had 100 acres, he said, by the way, I bought the rights of this guy, and his estate is something else, so now lots 1 and 2 are going to be owned by this person. Right? So it wasn't 181. People that wanted to come here. And it was further interesting because some of the proprietors sold their rights to people that lived in other towns. They may have lived in Windsor or Haddam or Middletown or any of the other towns that were around, and they heard about this sale and they said, hey boy, where I am, it's bad. I'm looking for land, so I'm going to buy the rights in New Hartford. Or maybe they were speculators, I don't know. Just an interesting thing to think about. But not everybody came here to have a better life. They came here speculating to make more money, but some certainly did come because they wanted to raise a family, and they were really farmers in Hartford who wanted to be farmers in Hartford because they didn't have, their children could not be employed in the trades that were available at that time. So they said, let's bite the bullet, claim the land in New Hartford, gather ourselves up, go out there and hope to heavens that we can make a living. This is 16 miles. I don't know what town was developed. I don't know what the development of Avon was. But there may have been a stop in Avon where they could stop to get food or get resupplied or lumber or whatever that means. I don't know. But to me, it's just amazing. They're going 16 miles. There's no guarantee, since there was no road, somebody had established a path and said, well, let's make this the path to New Hartford. I think there's room through these trees, so that if people want to come with a wagon, there's space to get through these trees. I don't know. Right? But anyway, after that happened, and they came back to the people, in Hartford and said, okay, this is your lot. Many of those people said, I really want a farm. This lot is too small. The space you've given me, how can I be sure that I have enough wood to heat my home for the winter? So I need more territory. And there's plenty left. So they said, okay, we'll divide, we'll have another division. And this division was with the intention that they would establish boundaries so that people could choose where their next distribution of land would be. So what they did then is they laid up highways from the western boundary, Torrington, 3/4 of a mile apart, starting at the southern boundary and running north. And they ran as straight as they could until something obstructed it. You know, huge rocks that nobody could drive a cart over, and the surveyors didn't want to deal with it. So anyway, that map of the second division showed, or before the second division, shows these highways. So they came back to the people and said, here you are. They threw 181 names, and they said, this time, you're going to get half an acre for every pound value of your estate. And by the way, after I don't know how many there weren't 181 anymore, because people had sold rights. There were less than that. And all these numbers were documented in a book that I prepared about 20 years ago. But at any rate, you could look it up. They said, okay, number 1 to whatever the heck it was. And then we'll just reverse the list, and the last guy on the list will be the first guy on the next choice. Now, it's very interesting to me personally, because the house I live in was a descendant of Cyprian Watson, who was the last person on the second list, and therefore the first person on the third list. So he got a full acre for every pound of his estate. And I think when he put those together, it turned out to be, I don't know, 250 acres or something. So after that was done, there was still more land. And so then it just progresses. In totality, though, each one of those rights of the proprietor, they were entitled to slightly over 2 acres per pound of their estate. So another interesting sideline. Many of these proprietors were certainly property owners, but there was a large family called the Merrill family, who were very prominent in Hartford at that time. And I think I went through the mathematics of this by looking up and adding up the value of the estates for Merrills. And I think from my calculations, I figured that they were entitled to almost 20% of the total land mass in New Hartford. So just another little quirk things that you find out and you wonder, gee, that's interesting, how that happened, why that happened. I get it. Well, when I talk about these things, I guess I'm of old school. When I look at something, I say, I always thought history is about what and when. This happened on this date. Now I say, why did that happen? How did that happen? So when I look at history now, I say, Oh, that's it. Yeah, there was a war. Why did that happen? Why did that happen? How did they do that? How did they do these things? Draw these maps. Surveyors, if you understand surveying, they didn't have a pocket calculator. They went out there and they said, okay, you're entitled to 50 acres, and you want me to start at 25, 150 feet from the southern boundary, and you're getting 40 acres, so the distance between these boundaries is such a distance, and so they had to scribble down on paper, slate, multiplication tables. No way they could exist without knowing multiplication tables. And in the field, they said, okay, I gotta go so many feet to establish the next boundary. Those are the kind of things that fascinate me. They're out here in the woods, 16 miles from their home. What happens? How do they live? Where do they get their food? Where do they get their water? What kind of shelter did they have? They're writing this down. There was no pencil, no eraser. It was written down in ink. It certainly couldn't get wet, could it? Right? On big pieces of paper? I don't know. You think about how the heck did they ever do this in the first place? But anyway, then it progressed from there, and then finally, by 1738, now remember, this only started in 1733. By 1738, there were enough people here that they petitioned the governor, to the colonial government, and said, look, here's the number of people we have. We would like to be established as a town. The colonial government said, where's your church going to be? And it looks like everything is ordered. So in October of 1738, you can establish a town. And in December of 1738, they established a town. And they had their first town meeting in a proprietor's house up on Town Hill in the middle of winter. All the minutes of that meeting are in the records downstairs. They tell you what the order of business was, who they elected. Interesting thing, when you look at the people they elected, there were 3 selectmen elected. One of them had bought rights. I think he was from Middletown, or he wasn't from Hartford. It was Kelsey. Big Kelsey was one of the 3 selectmen. The second one was, I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, it'll come back to me. He was a deacon in the church in Hartford, but he was not a proprietor. He had obviously bought rights right place. And the third one was a proprietor. If you look, he was a descendant of the proprietors. Remember I talked about this guy who was lucky on the list, last on the 2nd division and first on the 3rd division, Cyprian Watson? He was a proprietor. And he got elected, I don't know, tax collector or something. Other people got elected constable. And I'm going to do another presentation, probably around December, to celebrate the first town meeting. We'll show a picture of where the houses were and what they did in the first town meeting. But Cyprian Watson, I don't know whether I said this before, but I was particularly interested in him because the house I live in is a Watson house. And this search of mine to find out where my property came from, he was a second generation of Cyprian Watson. So that struck a chord with me, obviously.
David,
So by that point in time, we had the first,
time check. We should probably start going through the slides.
oh, God. I can do that.
Okay.
So we're up to 1738. By 1745, all the land had been distributed.
Can you go back to the timeline? That would be helpful.
It doesn't associate with what he's talking about here. I guess
All
it
the
is.
land had been distributed. So the proprietors who had been responsible for dividing the land up said, land which we hadn't divided up belongs to the town of New Hartford. So the town became the owners of the highways and all the vacant land. And that really is the end of what happened. So let me just quickly go through. There you go. I'm not going to go through this again, but you can peruse that thing from 1600.
Well, I think one thing that we want to establish with this is the Connecticut colony that was formed, in 1636, and it almost took 100 years for that land grant to happen. So it's quite the amount of time it took for people to move down to Hartford, and they're like, oh, there's land out west. Someone's got to get out there. So that's when they said, all right, send that out. But that was 100 years later. It's just kind of shocking.
Okay. So that's what it looked like. Now, not all of these blocks that I show as developed towns, but a lot of them along the coastline, and many of the interior ones are already bought by people and established. Go to the next one. They divided it in half. And this is the eastern half. There you see which parcels. Next slide. This is Sector 32, when people said 181, choose the southeast parcel.
Use the mic.
Thank you. 181, choose the southeast parcels. 220, recent, one of the others. Next slide. And here, you see this helps describe what the land must have been like. Yellow Mountain, that's at Nepal. When you drove north on South Road to the center of Nepal and you hit 202, all of a sudden you look in front of you. They wanted to make a highway, they went straight through there. But there's a mountain there. The Nepal River, named after the Indians at that time, Mongsaka Pond, in the left corner. That pond was there. The Farmington River at that time was called Tunxus. Vast swamp. That's important to think about because one of the criteria that the king established, I'm going to give you this land over there across the ocean. But all these charters for these colonial governments had the clause, if you find any gold, you send it back to the king. And if there are any tall trees that would make good masts for our ships, they're reserved for the king as well. So I looked at this map and I said, vast swamp, there must be very tall trees there. If I have Yellow Mountain, there are probably a lot of tall trees there too. The rest of it seemed to be fairly arable land. Next slide. So the only significance here is in May. It was called the Southeast Parcel until May of 1733. After May of 1733, it was called Hartford. So these are the home lots. So you can imagine you're sitting in Hartford, I want to go out there. Which one of those lots did you give, surveyors did you give to me? The guy looks at it and said, I don't think so. There's got to be a better way. To establish that better way, next slide.
It's just a detailed, closer view of what those lots look like.
Next slide. So these were the highways that I talked about. And you see, where they could, they connected them in the north with the highways that they had laid out for home lots. Next slide.
I've got a detail. Oh, no, I don't.
Oh, yeah, this is December 1738, first town meeting. These are the lots of the prominent people that were elected at the first town meeting, and you see where they lived. A lot of them were up in Town Hill.
So this is the detail. So this is up on Town Hill Road. You see it here. This is Town Hill Road. And the meeting house, the tax collector, the meeting house was, oh, this is Loomis, Israel Loomis is up here. The meeting house wasn't established yet.
The meeting was held in a house. There was no meeting house. Next slide. You're familiar with the story about the church that snapped itself. This is not the first meeting house, but that church was on the site of the previous meeting house. So on that site up there at the corner of Town Hill and Hoppin Road, that's where the original meeting house was. The original meeting house was a one-story timber structure, I don't know, 20 feet by 40 feet, I don't exactly remember. But until that time, and this is a wonderful story, if you want to get into the detail of what happened on that site. To get the meeting house, they decided to buy the land from a property owner, and they bought that land. And the front part of it was devoted to where the meeting house was going to be, and the back part of it, to the east, was where they were going to have the burial ground. That burial ground is still there. Mary Lorraine can tell you all about who's buried there. Okay. Oh, and the other thing I want to mention, at this time frame was the first deed that I found that there was any transfer of colonial ownership to a person who was an American Indian. And that happened in this area here, which roughly is down in Satan's Kingdom, you know, on the Canton side of the Farmington River. This North Country Road is approximately where Route 44 is today. So that gives you a point of reference.
202. Route 202, David. 202. 202, not Route 44.
Route 44.
Okay.
44 goes north south.
This is front.
Yeah.
He's right.
Okay.
To 140.
I know we got to hurry up here. So everything continued. More and more people came. By this time, because these people had to get to church every Sunday, there were a whole lot of people up there in in this western area. And they went to the colonial legislature and they said, look, I've been doing this for too many years. Sundays are a real burden. I want to go to church. But there's a church closer to me. Turns out the church they were talking about is a church in Canton, which is the Congregational Church in Canton Center or North Canton, whatever it is. So the colonial legislature said, no problem. You know, your church taxes now are paid there. And then after that, what do we have after that?
So that land that those homeowners, instead of going to Hartford, they're now going to Simsbury. So that land was annexed from New Hartford and handed over to Simsbury.
Yes, at that time that territory at that time was still part of Simsbury. Now it's part of Canton, so then you get a picture of how did Simsbury get divided up, you know? Whole nother issue. So, what our town zoning enforcement officer was able to do, and what's the date of that map?
1745.
Down in the right hand.
1745.
Stays up the whole thing.
It's not there.
Move the whole thing up.
It's not there.
I think it was. Anyway, I'm pretty sure it was in 2015. What he did, he took the property map in 2015, and he overlaid it on my map of 1745. So on one map, now you're able to see, identify your property. If you're a property owner in New Hartford, you can look at that map and say, that's my property. And you can find out who owned it all the way back there. So that's the facility I was always looking for, is the ability for a novice to be able to come to a set of maps. I don't know whether I said it at the start, but when I started this search, the only maps that were available were 1852. And then there was a published map, published in, I'm kind of like a road map. What do they call those great books? Atlas. Atlas. So 1852, 1874, and I want to go before that. So this is what I've discovered and the process I went through to find it. And hopefully, with that information, if you're interested, you'll be able to do that on your own property. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
I'd be happy to hang around and answer questions, or if there are general questions now. General question.
David, is that map accessible online for people to look at their property with the overlay?
We can make it available, yes.
That would be great.
I was going to ask the same thing about the whole series of maps that were.
Yes, so this whole presentation that we have here, we will make this available online, so you can go through. We tried to, David did a great job of describing everything, but we tried to also put it down in some detail on the slides themselves, so that you can go through it yourselves. We've also recorded the presentation today, so you can go through it again, look at the slides as we go, and this will all be available on our website.
Excellent.
Yes, answer to that question. I have a booklet here, which is a slightly different format than the slides that you see here. But it's essentially the same story I told you. This I prepared this year. document, which is available from the Historical Society, I prepared in 1998. And it's a written presentation of what I tried to communicate to you orally this evening. So all the detail is here. The names of every owner of those original lots. How much land they were given, when it was surveyed. A story about how long did it take the surveyors to do this. So this is kind of a written document of my oral presentation. Yes?
What's the oldest,
Will you interpret for me?
Yeah.
what's the oldest house still standing?
What's the oldest house still standing in
New Hartford.
That's interesting that you say that, because we don't really know. But if you look at colonial architecture, just the architecture of the buildings give you a clue as to the time frame in which it was built. The very simplest houses that were built, that are still standing, are, in my opinion, of a Cape style, one-story Cape style, center chimney, heating, cooking fireplace in the back of the center chimney, a heating on the left and a heating on the right.
Are they designated as?
Donald Plant is now working with me. I have identified for her a list of about 16 Cape-style houses. And what she's doing with this information, tracing the current address back through the records to see if you can get back to here, or starting, that house originally was on this lot, starting in the beginning and going forward. So that is another presentation which is in the works. But since you asked the question about the oldest houses, the next style that came to New Hartford, which was called Saltbox style house. When the family got bigger, they entered the second floor, they put a lean-to on the back, right? Those were Saltbox houses. There are another 15 or 18 of those. And after that, I didn't want to go any farther. So I have personally traced the ownership of some of those Cape-style houses. But Donna, the plant, is helping me do the others. I'll be looking in the future for somebody to help me do the Saltbox style houses, because those appear to be the ones that were most substantially built and have endured the environment the longest. But it's my opinion that the earliest houses, because the people that lived here at that first town meeting, I don't think any of those houses existed. I don't think any of those houses existed at that time. They have been replaced by other houses. But it's my opinion that probably, certainly by 1740, there were houses here that still exist today. I know there are Saltbox houses that were built in the 40s here.
Were there any stone houses?
Now some of these houses that exist today are really, they become additions to that Cape-style house. They didn't change it to a Saltbox. they waited until the 1800s and built a 1800 style next to it, so. Next,
I was asking.
because I'm hearing from them.
Yeah, are there any stone houses?
Stone houses?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
there are some stone houses.
Greystone,
Town?
down in Pine Meadow.
Yes.
Greystone, right. I have the complete history of that house. I have the history of all the brick houses
Right.
that exist. Right? Greystone house. I mean, I got the history, but I can't give the exact dates, but it's in the 1850s, I'm guessing. Right? It's part of the manufacturing development in the Pine Meadow with the Chapin factory and the expansion of the mills across the river here. And the brick houses next to it, those were all, owners of those houses were all manufacturers as well, and owners of other properties and businesses.
Sir.
Is the historical society, this is not general, this is a general question.
Sure.
There is no comprehensive architectural survey of the town of New Hartford.
No.
Is there does the historical society have an interest in doing that and seeking funds from the Connecticut State Historic Preservation?
Most definitely, yes.
Is there any action on that?
Let me talk to you afterwards.
Sure.
That'd be great. Great. What other questions we have? Yes, Ms. Bailey.
I'm gonna pick up, my name's Ann Bailey. I'm gonna pick up on some of the things you said, because I'll be doing a presentation sometime, probably in October, with an outing connected to it, because it's real Loomis land that David referred to when the first town meeting was held. I discovered only since I talked to David recently was the first town meeting, and that's the land that my grandfather bought in 1910 from the Loomis family. It was still in the Loomis family abandoned farmland, and it is now the most recent town park called Beakley Gardens, because Mason Beakley, who bought it from my father 25 years ago, the family after he died, the family leased it to the town for 50 years as a town park, and I've donated it in some. I had the back 50 acres, that 80-acre parcel, which showed on this map as one of those original parcels up there where Henry Loomis had his first town meeting. And Mike talked about architecture. My grandmother in 1910 bought it from her cousin who lived in the parsonage, which is the house up on top of Town Hill. She had been to a Japanese house in Jackson Garden, Chicago, and she designed this house to look like a Japanese house. So we had a slightly different kind of architecture here in New Hartford. And I have a whole presentation I'm going to put together with pictures over the past time since 1910, when that house was built on abandoned farmland, to what it looks like today as Beakley Gardens. And I'm the third generation to live there. My daughter built next door to me on Stubb Hollow, which is where my house is. So she's now the fourth generation living on the land that was the first town meeting. So keep yourselves posted for the presentation. It may be in October sometime, and afterwards we're going to do an outing up to the land, walk around on the property, and I can show you some of the places that we talked about in the show.